Hey everyone, it's a beautiful Saturday afternoon here in Montreal. For those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Derek Royden. I'm a writer, a freelance writer. I write an article every week for a website, usually every week for a website called nationofchange.org. Progressive News and Views, it's really worth checking out. Some great writers working over there, so I highly recommend going there and paying them a visit. So, for today's vlog, I wanted to talk about an article called California Burning by William Finnegan. It was in the August 16th issue of the New York Review of Books. Now, Finnegan reviews three different books, but I'm just going to concentrate on one that he gets to near the end, just basically in terms of time constraints. So, the book he's talking about is Edward Struzik's Firestorm, and Finnegan mentions that Struzik is a Canadian science writer, and he concentrates on wildfires in the boreal, mountainous, and subalpine forests of North America and the Arctic tundra. Wildfire is no longer a California spectacle, Struzik writes. His tone is reportorial, not apocalyptic, but the picture he paints is dire. The Arctic is heating up twice as fast as the rest of the globe. We've become accustomed to seeing that tragedy dramatized by starving polar bears, the accelerating retreat of glaciers and sea ice, and the thawing of permafrost. Wildfires driving polar bears from their dens is something new, though, at least to me. But the size, frequency, range, and intensity of wildfires in Alaska and northern Canada have increased far more rapidly than in lower, more populated latitudes. Megafires have become every year events up north. Soot and ash from these northern fires is blackening glaciers and the Greenland ice cap, causing them to melt at an even faster rate. So Finnegan goes on to write, boreal forests store enormous amounts of carbon that megafires release, to the detriment of the global environment. High-latitude peatlands store carbon that is released by tundra fires. Peat also stores vast amounts of mercury, which fire releases into the atmosphere. The lower edge of the stratosphere is significantly lower at higher latitudes, and the fire clouds created by northern megafires, known as pyrocumulus, meteorological freaks that create their own weather, pouring lightning and embers back down on the ground, can also propel smoke upward, directly into the stratosphere, where it becomes a global problem, Struzik writes. The smoke from Canadian fires had been found to travel around the entire globe more than once. And this is something I think that's often forgotten about in terms of, for the last 30 or so years, we've been talking about globalization and increasingly globalized world of trade connections. We've also, of course, had the internet introduced, which allows people to speak to each other regardless of the distance between them. But we rarely ever see conversations about how the actual environment, Mother Nature, the thing that sustains life, is all connected as well. So when something happens in California, when there's wildfires, like massive wildfires like this summer in California, it affects the air quality of people much, much further away. And these kind of things need to be recognized so that we can proceed to try and at least slow down our march towards our own destruction. And further to this idea, Finnegan goes on to write, the rate of hospitalization of elderly Americans on the eastern seaboard has spiked, according to researchers at Johns Hopkins, as a direct result of smoke from Canadian wildfires in 2002 that contained a significant amount of mercury. Air quality in New York and Chicago has been measurably degraded by Canadian wildfires. An Australian-Canadian research team looking at global wildfires estimated that between 260,000 and 600,000 deaths may be attributable to wildfire smoke each year. Forest fires increase the level of mercury in wetlands. They also sweep across abandoned mine sites, sometimes releasing toxins. In Libby, Montana, a town that sits in a wildfire corridor, where an old mine has left asbestos fires embedded in the bark of trees, people live in fear of a fire that, as Struzik writes, will spew out needle-like cancer-causing asbestos fires. The water quality of Fort McMurray, Alberta, where 88,000 people were evacuated in 2016 during a megafire that probably a lot of people watching this will remember, has been compromised by the soot and chemicals that now blanket the watershed. In Colorado, drinking water quality suffered for years after a megafire in 2002. Some major fires burned so hot that the soil is sterilized and forests cannot even begin to regenerate. And then Finnegan goes on, there's Russia, which has the world's largest boreal forest and is already suffering more tree loss from fire than any other country. The planet's biggest carbon stores threaten to become carbon sources, supercharging global warming. Of course, this is the whole process, is that as we burn down the forests, you'll see many rainforests in the world, not just in the Amazon, they're releasing the carbon that's stored in the forest into the atmosphere, thus accelerating this process. You see it in a lot of things, but for example, the melting of the permafrost in the north also releases much more carbon into the atmosphere. They believe now that it's possibly at the same rate as fossil fuels in terms of what's being emitted. So this speeds up the process. So Finnegan goes on to write, Indonesian peat fires, also illegal and done for agricultural land clearing, cover much of Southeast Asia in a toxic haze for several months a year and triple Indonesia's annual greenhouse gas emissions. Now we can add boreal forest megafires and increasingly flammable tundra to the list of not quite natural disasters darkening our planetary future. Finnegan closes by saying, the world is not ending, needless to say. There are more geological periods to come, but it is once again getting hotter and more flammable. Political decisions have put us on this track. Different political decisions might slow our momentum toward catastrophic overheating. Unfortunately, the Trump administration shows little awareness of what's at stake. And in fairness to this, no one's shown really that much awareness of what's at stake. The Paris Climate Accord was very important, mainly in a symbolic way. It was a terrible thing that Trump did when he pulled out of it, but we have to understand that most countries that were actually signatories and remain signatories to that probably won't live up to their commitments. But this is not to downplay the terrible things that the Trump administration is doing in terms of public lands, in terms of opening up areas that were protected to exploitation, especially by fossil fuel companies and other extractive industries. But we have to take a longer term view, in a sense that this is a long fight, and that in order to win, first we start with ourselves, and then we can start to try and change the political system. But ultimately, there are things that individual people can do, things like eat less meat, compost, try not to use too much plastic. I know it's very difficult, but you can start on an individual level, and then you can influence other people's behavior from there, and hopefully use your vote, if you live in a democracy, to get the kind of politicians who are actually going to address these issues. It's us against these interests, like oil interests and coal interests, that are only interested in money and don't care about that natural world. And I know that most of the people watching this do. So I hope you all have a great day, and that you remember